when Keith and I were putting the program together for this, we really wanted to focus on the key areas that are going to affect people moving forward, especially startups and entrepreneurs. And obviously, one of the big topics that everyone talks about all the time is the CARES Act. So we wanted to really bring experts in from the legal standpoint, accounting, and HR to really give you a high level perspective on how you should attack this, right? I mean, the first money kind of went out the door pretty quickly. A lot of people didn't get a chance to get it. So there's a lot to unmask, not just from the aspect of how do I get money, but once I get money, what do I do with it, right? Where can I use it for? How can I get these loans forgiven and things like that? So we wanted to approach this a little bit different. As far as the moderation, we talked back and forth. So what I'm going to do is just hand it over to these individual panelists and let them just talk from their point of view. They're going to give their top points about, what you should do. So what I suggest right now is to get your pen and paper out and just write down the points that they have. And then if we have time, we'll open it up for questions. So just type your questions in the chat box and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with Ben Jacob. He is a business attorney at Fourscore Law, and he's going to share his top points on how the CARES Act will impact startups from a legal perspective. So Ben, why don't you take it?
Okay, thank you, Mark. Great to be with everybody. At Fourscore, we have, as Mark mentioned, a number of our clients are startups, early stage startups. We represent businesses of all sizes, but a number of startups have reached out, especially about the CARES Act and some of the programs available for businesses, and we've heard a little bit about that already. But just some of the highlights that, the CARES Act creates or expands for loan programs for small businesses. And the most popular we've already started talking about is the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. And just wanted to focus on that. There's also the EIDL, the Emergency Disaster Relief Loan Advances. But talking about the PPP, for anyone who's either joining in or is unfamiliar, PPP provides low interest forgivable loans for small businesses that have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And as we just heard, the first round of funding ran out pretty quickly. I think it was 13 days. The SBA certified $349 billion. I think 2019 alone, they only did 28 billion. So it's an astonishing amount of capital that's being deployed. And then we have the second round of $310 billion currently being worked through. And I think they're, from what I've heard, not confirmed, but they're about halfway through the remaining funds there. So those are some of the highlights of the PPP. As far as for startups, I know Heather's going to talk about eligibility. So I don't want to go much into that. The other question for startups is, that we've heard is should they even care about the PPP? And there's been some headlines about the negative attention businesses have received, venture-backed companies, publicly traded companies, and there's a lot involved in that. But as far as for startups, I mean, we know there's a wide range of startups, and we see that with our clients, founders that have taken on incredible risks, and overnight their market disappeared, and they're hurting and they need some help. And so we definitely advise our clients. I think it's great to stay on top of both the CARES Act, the PPP program, and I think it's a good idea, whether it's right for you right now, to stay on top of what the federal government is doing. There's so much uncertainty around the timeline for this, and they're already talking about what possible rounds might need to follow on to replenish the PPP program for other programs. So startups, it's a great time to stay agile and look for opportunities to create more runway for your business. So that's a little plug on whether you should care. I think the PPP could present some crucial a lifeline during these times. The second thing, let's assume you are eligible. Another big item for our clients, just talking about the process for considering whether you should apply, how you go about doing that. We highly recommend your leadership team, your board, they should meet, you should meet, discuss, one, whether the company actually needs the funds and why. Number two, what approved purposes the PPP funds are going to be used for. And then also to document, are there any reasons not to accept funds? And this is just this is going to be good if you do have to answer any questions from a curious auditor. But it's also good for the process to kind of get things aligned from the beginning on the right track, because you want to make sure you're avoiding any sort of even a misperception of a misuse of funds. So having that process documented is really important. And then two, businesses that apply for PPP funds, they're going to need to certify that it's necessary to support ongoing operations. And so that's a question I think needs to be carefully thought through. And having confidence moving forward with the decision, once that's in place. So I think it's good to document that as well. And then another thing, I think there's been confusion, and understandably so, when the government is essentially moving $2 trillion of stimulus relief. There's a lot of messiness, and the guidelines have been evolving. So there's been some confusion about the use of funds, and again, I believe Heather's going to go into that. So one of the big ones I'll just highlight is just that there's been some confusion as far as the use of funds around on payroll, and 75% of the funds, whether you want forgiveness or not, will need to be used on payroll. And Heather can clarify or add on if there's anything I misspoke on there. And then finally, something we've been talking both with our clients as well as internally, just noting, the economic disruption from the Great Recession is still fresh in many people's minds. And I think there's recognition that these times present opportunities. And I think we've heard some of that today. And so it is a great time to kind of look over your business and think through what are the opportunities for my business to moving forward, and kind of tracking the developments closely, but seeing, what can you do? You're already hearing stories of startups pivoting overnight to a new model. And I'm blanking on the name. There's a company that quickly pivoted to pick up curbside pickup, and they raised a fairly substantial round of funding this past week. So there's amazing opportunities out there, and there's a lot of reasons that can cause us concern, but those I think would be our starting points that we've been highlighting for our clients.
Thank you, Ben. Really appreciate that. So now I want to turn to the accounting side. So I'd love to introduce Heather Dean. She is the partner at the accounting firm HPG, and she's going to share her top points on the CARES Act from an accounting perspective. Heather?
Better unmute there. Thanks. So the CARES Act was signed into law on March 27th, which kind of couldn't come at a worse time for tax professionals because, of course, we have our annual April 15th deadline right around then. And even though the April 15th deadline was extended from a federal perspective to July 15th, what we found was that a lot of states were not so quick to the game and did not get their legislation enacted to change that date as well. So we were scrambling still around that time when the CARES Act was signed into law, but it was clear immediately that given the PPP loan and the funds that we expected would be depleted quickly, that we had to get on that and really help advise clients on how to take advantage of that program. So I would say that the biggest difficulty in the beginning was just the amount of misinformation out there. And so the original program came out, we were studied up on it, but there was a lot of interpretation out there, and some of it conflicting with what the banks understood. With you know, the SBA put out pretty mundane directives in the beginning, and then as we know, as tax professionals, we start getting into the meat of things, and we have questions that come up, and what do we do with this? What do we do with that? And so that very beginning week there of trying to get companies ready to be in application ready on the 3rd of April when it opened up was a difficult week at best. So, but we got there, and those companies, I think, that were prepared and ready on hunches and kind of working with their bank in advance were more successful. That said, the day before the applications came out, the application changed the next morning. So, and I'm sure everyone has heard in the press of how difficult the program has gone, just from difficult for the bankers because they're trying to understand everything in real time as well. So the eligibility requirement, there were some frequently asked questions, the FAQs that came out, and the AICPA, I think, that's our organization, the American Institute of CPAs, has done an extremely good job of helping to navigate and really working with the SBA and Treasury to guide them around. These are the issues that tax practitioners are having. And so we saw these FAQs coming out that were addressing our questions, which was great. And so now round 2 has gone through, and we've had clients have differing levels of success, some of which weren't necessarily because they weren't eligible for the program. I've had some that the bank had their own kind of set of rules that they had to work with. So it's been troublesome from a practitioner's perspective to try to work with companies, because we're not the bankers who are approving these loans. So we had to just do the best that we could with the guidance that was out there. Now we're kind of in the phase of the second phase of money is going, and the next big thing on people's minds is really this loan forgiveness, and what are we doing to help make sure that they are able to capitalize on that as much as possible. So right now, the definitions are not very well established. So obviously there's this precursor around payroll. Almost all of the provisions of the CARES Act are really payroll focused for good reason. They want to encourage companies to keep people on the payroll and to keep companies operating. It's a little difficult for some when you've got a stay-at-home act right now that doesn't really allow them to do that. So a little bit of what the premise of the PPP is a little counterintuitive for some companies, because they really can't put their people back to work. So there's a lot of interpretation with this loan forgiveness still, I think, at play. And the AICPA, again, this week is advocating. And just this week, they sent some directives to the SBA saying, Treasury saying, hey, we think that the loan forgiveness should be interpreted using these parameters around the 8 weeks. The 8 weeks should start when to align better with the pay periods, and perhaps they should start when the stay-at-home orders are lifted in the different areas, because companies are really restrictive on what they can do and have people doing in many cases. So I think we're going to see a lot more from the AICPA pushing, and I would recommend, if you're trying to, like Ben said, like your startup company, you don't have probably a giant budget to kind of keep your tax professionals and legal professionals on hand, although we're trying to put out information as much as we can. But keeping up on what the AICPA is pushing, I think, is a good indicator of if you're trying to watch what's going on. Because I would say, in terms of organizations, they've been really forefront on the guidance that's out there. So if you're working through those calculations and trying to figure out what does that mean, I had a call yesterday with a client, or this week with a client. They're trying to figure out utilities. Well, for them, utilities is they got Amazon Web Services. That's a giant utility for a tech company. Is that a utility that qualifies? It's difficult to say without having a lot of a lot of intel, around these definitions. So we do have a COVID website up on our website on hpg.com. So we're trying to actively update that as things come along. I would say the other big thing, kind of like in conjunction with this forgiveness, is this FAQ number 31 that came out last week, and the things that Ben has mentioned with Treasury Secretary mentioned, saying, hey, if you don't need this money, you need to give it back, or you shouldn't have taken it. So there's a drop dead date starting next week, or ending next week, I guess, the 7th of May, where companies, if they feel like they've taken the money and they can't substantiate the reasons for having done so adequately, and I think there's a fear factor right now for some companies who can maybe see a trickle down effect, and they know their company is going to be affected, but they're trying to keep people employed now. Does that qualify? I mean, there aren't a lot of good parameters out there right now, and the timeline is very limited in terms of making that presumption if you're good or not. So we've had plenty of phone calls in the past week of just more panic around companies saying, should we give this money back? And it's like, I just was answering the email as I was getting started to speak on the same thing. And they rifted a group of people this year. Well, that's probably eligible. It's the people who companies have kind of gone on as usual. You're going to have to really do, as Ben said, a lot of documentation around what the necessary needs of that fund. And we would recommend having a separate account for that, so that you can substantiate how you're paying that. So the documentation is going to be key. The bigger the loan, I think the bigger you're going to want to, the more you're going to want to be prudent around that. Jim said last week that 2 million plus is going to get audited. So there's an expectation around that. So, and then last night, we got a notice from the IRS late yesterday, notice 2020-32, and I scrambled and wrote an article this morning that's on our website, talks a little bit about it, but that notice has come out, and again, these are groups asking for clarification on the treatment of the expenses. And traditionally, when you have kind of tax-free income, which the loan is deemed to be, then oftentimes the expenses associated with tax-free income are not deductible. And indeed, in this notice last night, the IRS clarified this. So again, this is another facet of something that needs to be looked at in terms of you're giving that back because you're not going to get this double dipping that a lot of companies thought they were going to get with having tax-free income and then still getting the use of expenses. So I think there's a lot of scrambling, and that would be the word that I would use from March 20th, even before that, kind of the week of March 27th as this was coming out. It's just been a scramble, and companies already in panic mode, having to adjust daily and really dynamic rules around and clarification. So, so should I give back the PP is a big question right now. And then finally, it's the CARES Act has a bunch of other things. So for startup companies, it's a little tricky because if you're not able to keep people on payroll, a lot of these are very payroll driven. So there's the employee retention credit. So I didn't do the PPP. I've had a greater than 50% change in decrease in my business, and there's a lot of parameters around that to kind of scrub through. But can I take that credit? So you can't take both, but perhaps that would work for you. Can I delay paying my payroll taxes in? That's another option that's out there. And then the other ones are more geared towards companies that are making money. So if you had a net operating loss this year, the carryback rules have changed. So if you had income last year, you can carry back and claim that tax that was paid. So if you're not making money, that's a tricky thing to do for a startup. So there's refunds for alternative minimum tax credits that have been paid in. Again, you would have had to pay tax in that situation. So qualified improvement, some expanded rules around taking expense deductions to help people out this year. Again, you gotta be taxable for that to really be impactful. I would say the big thing that I think we'll see from a compliance perspective is that $8.3 billion went into kind of what I would think is kind of our life science community. I hope a lot of it anyway. And just for the prevention and treatment of COVID-19. So what our expectation is that we'll be seeing a lot of the R&D tax credits. So kind of parsing out of what's eligible, what's not for R&D tax credits, which companies will typically take even if they have losses, if they're eligible, because that's a future tax asset for them. But then also grant audits. I mean, that's something that I think these companies that are taking federal funds from the NIH, they got to be watchful of those hitting those trigger limits of thresholds that would create a grant audit. 750K is like disbursements in a year. I have a partner, Lauren Joyce, she does all this stuff. She's great at it. So if you're getting those grants and have some questions, please feel free to give us a call and I can connect you to Lauren to talk through that. But again, another big compliance thing to be prepared for, because those are the things that people are not focusing on right now.
Thank you, Heather, so much for that. Appreciate it. All the great knowledge. Now, to kind of move it to an HR perspective, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Burgess, who's the Principal Human Capital Business Partner at Trinet. So, Mark, take it away. He's got to get unmuted.
Appreciate that. I do want to talk just a little bit. Press Alt A. Am I muted still?
No, you're good. You're good.
Excellent, excellent. So from a human resources perspective, so you've heard a lot of information about the PPP loans. And of course, that's designed that when you get those funds, you're going to bring your people back to work. Well, it sounds really simple. Hey, I've opened my doors. I'm ready to go. Employees come on back. We're ready to go. If only it were that simple. So I certainly want to touch on some things that you need to be thinking about as an employer in terms of what about workers' comp exposure? What about employees that even though I've said we're open, come on back, they say no, they're not comfortable. What do I do in that situation? What about individuals that maybe need maternity leave or when they're in the high risk category? So there's a lot of interacting parts there that you need to be aware of as you bring folks back into the workforce. I'll touch on just a few of those. And I'll start with an example. I had a client yesterday I talked with. They're in North Carolina, so they've been closed pursuant to the North Carolina guidelines. They anticipate opening back up on May 11th, which is the current calendar. So they happen to have an employee who's in her 9th month of pregnancy. So she's currently on furlough along with all of the other employees. They're scheduled to come back on May 11th. She's due May 25th. Well, she's pregnant. She's in a high-risk category, so that much is pretty easy. But what happens in those 2 weeks from May 11th, they open back up. May 25th is her due date. So she's 2 weeks there, and she doesn't have pay. She's no longer on furlough. Well, then you start talking about, well, there is some of the federal sick time that's available to her because she would have a doctor's note that says she's in a high-risk category. So that covers her for that time period. But then you have leave of absence. She would need to go on leave of absence. So again, just some examples of the moving parts of some challenges you may get from some of your employees based on their individual circumstances. You may open the door and you may have an employee that says, you know, that's great, but I'm not comfortable coming back. I have someone in my household that's in a high-risk category and I can't risk being back in the workplace even though you've opened the doors. So they may or may not be eligible for sick time, but you may need to consider unpaid leaves of absence. So you need to really be aware of circumstances, ask questions, and I guess my strongest piece of advice is don't jump to employment decisions. Hey, I've got my doors open, you need to be back. If you can't come back, maybe we need to move on. I mean, I don't think employers would necessarily take that stance, but just a word of caution that you really need to be prepared, ask questions and drill down and understand what is that employee's concern. Is it a family situation? Is it a workplace situation? Maybe the workplace is a small office. You all are almost literally on top of one another. And now just because the government says, hey, all's good, come on back in and let's get back to work. Well, obviously folks are going to have some discomfort about that. How safe is the workplace? And as an employer, what guidelines do you have in place for your workplace? Do you have some measure to sort of social distance people in the workplace? Do you have a rotating schedule of who comes into the office week over week so that maybe you don't have your full head count in at one time? What about cleaning processes? How often is the office cleaned? Do you need hand sanitizer? How do you treat the break room? So you just need to be aware that you may be getting a lot of questions, a lot of voices of concerns from your employees about, is it safe? What if I don't feel comfortable coming back? So just be prepared to have those conversations. Certainly feel free to reach out. I'm sure my email address is probably available to this group. I'm more than happy to answer questions like that. But we've talked so much about the funding, and that's certainly important. But then when we actually get people involved again, that's of course when the fun really starts, right? So just be prepared for that, and be prepared to have those tough conversations, to ask questions, to really get an understanding from your team on what they're experiencing and what you can do as an employer to give them that comfort level, and certainly mitigate your risk as an employer in making sure that your employees are safe. So that's right at my 5 minutes. So I will stop there and see what we have next up, Mark.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And we're a little bit over, and we're trying to stick on time as much as possible. So the biggest thing that I would encourage people to do is, Ben, Mark, and Heather will all make themselves available. We will share their emails address with you all if you have specific questions for them. Again, this is a big thing we're all trying to get through and figure out, even with these virtual events. So now I'm going to thank you again, everybody. Appreciate it, Ben, Heather, and Mark.